What's it like to witness the last journey of a murdered president? Lincoln's assassination left Americans shocked and grief-stricken, but it also opened the door for opportunistic criminals. President Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14, 1865, just 10 days after Washington, D.C. had been lit up in celebration. Confederate troops had abandoned Richmond, Virginia, and the Union Army was there to officially capture the Confederate capital. The famous surrender at Appomattox came a few days later, and then grief. One of the most fascinating insights into the earliest hours of Lincoln's funeral comes from Henry Brewster Stanton, who regularly moved in the presidential circle. He was standing front and center as they loaded Lincoln's body into a hearse bound for the White House. Stanton wrote, "At the east gate of the White House, there were soldiers, and no one was admitted to the grounds. This absence of a great crowd on such an occasion was not due to any want of interest or lack of sympathy, but was rather caused, it seemed to me, by the terrible shock that had passed over the city." He wrote that those who lined the way stood close enough to touch the hearse, and sobs filled the air. After his death on April 15th, President Lincoln's coffin was readied for burial in Springfield, Illinois on May 4th. Along the way, his remains traveled 1,645 miles through 400 towns in 7 states. The logistics of organizing the journey and the stops along the way were wildly impressive, especially considering there weren't many options for high-speed communication way back in the late 19th century. Against all odds, preparations for the president's final journey took just 4 days. Journalist Noah Brooks wrote about the widespread grief that had settled over Washington, D.C. All businesses were closed and flags flew at half-mast. Brooks wrote, "Nature seemed to sympathize in the general lamentation, and tears of rain fell from the moist and calmer sky. The wind sighed mournfully through the streets crowded with sad-faced people, and broad folds of funeral drapery flapped heavily in the wind." Funeral preparations meant ensuring the president's body remained in a suitable state for viewing, which required the newfangled technology of embalming. While those who saw Lincoln's body early in the journey remarked on how lifelike he remained, that wasn't the case by the time it reached New York City. By then, New York Evening Post editor William Cullen Bryant observed, "The genial, kindly face of Abraham Lincoln, it is but a ghastly shadow." Before being transported to his final resting place, Lincoln's remains were placed for viewing on top of a catafalque or funeral platform. But according to Mr. Lincoln's White House, a friend of the First Lady reported, "Mrs. Lincoln is very much disturbed by the noise. The other night, when putting them up, every plank that dropped gave her a spasm, and every nail driven reminded her of a pistol shot." An estimated 25,000 people passed through the East Room to bid their farewells. Noah Brooks described Lincoln's body resting 15 feet off the ground, swathed in black, surrounded by flowers and watched by an honor guard. Sitting alongside Lincoln was General Ulysses S. Grant, who wept openly throughout the viewing and the sermon. Interestingly, representatives from numerous churches were not only in attendance but spoke at the funeral, including Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist.
But Lincoln never joined a church. He was not a believer in organized religion.
And there was one person who was not in attendance, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was too distraught to be in public. The president's body was moved from the White House to the Capitol in a procession that included 6 white horses and an honor guard of Union soldiers, led by a group of black soldiers. Bringing up the rear were around 40,000 recently freed black men, women, and children. Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper covered the event, reporting, "Despite the enormous crowd, the silence was profound. It seemed akin to the death it commemorated. A solemn sadness reigned everywhere."
You won't be able to get anybody to agree on who a great president is, except Abraham Lincoln.
William Gamble, an officer with the Union Army and supervisor of the honor guard that stood watch over Lincoln in the Capitol, recalled, "It seemed as if 1,000,000 people had assembled and that Washington was a living mass of human beings of all kinds, shades, and colors. I have never dreamed of such a sight before and never expect to witness such an assembly again." Gamble's eyewitness account describes a full spectrum of responses. Many cursed, more cried, and occasionally they tried to reach out and touch the dead president. He wrote of one older woman who leaned forward to kiss him quickly. "I could not find it in my heart to say a word to her, but let her pass on as if I did not see it. You could form no idea of the scenes I saw." After several days in Washington, D.C., Lincoln's body was moved to the funeral train. The first stop along the route was Baltimore, where his body was on display for about an hour and a half. From there, it was on to Pennsylvania, where all state governors began opting to ride along in the train. The somber procession headed through New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Indiana, and on to Illinois. And throughout the journey, eyewitness reports were very similar.
If there was a chance to see the funeral train on the way back to Springfield, everybody wanted to be there.
Entire cities, even those the train only passed through, were draped in mourning colors. The tolling of bells and the singing of dirges filled the air, and crowds were eerily silent, except for the sobs. Mourners arranged themselves in an orderly fashion, and in some places, like Buffalo, New York, they marched in a spontaneous procession. Interestingly, the passage of the train actually changed history. Even legislators who had remained steadfastly opposed to emancipation changed their votes for ratification in honor of the fallen president. There were around 150 people who rode on Lincoln's funeral train, but Mary Todd Lincoln was not among them. She didn't attend any part of the funeral, and those few who saw her reported her absolute devastation at events as they unfolded. According to one witness, she was more dead than alive, broken by the horrors of that dreadful night. There was, however, another Lincoln who journeyed with him, Willie Lincoln. Willie had died a few years prior from typhoid fever, devastating his adoring father. The boy's remains had been placed in a temporary vault with the idea that, once his father's presidency was over, they'd return to Illinois as a family. And they did. Willie's casket was placed in the train even before his father's, and they made the journey side by side. Lincoln's assassination came on the heels of the Civil War, but New York Tribune writer Charles Page remarked on the sight of, quote, white and black side by side in the rain and the mud, and the lack of consciousness of any difference of color. Reports of the crowds that turned out to view the fallen leader are almost unimaginable. The Philadelphia North American and United States Gazette reported that mourners filed past at a rate of about 80 per minute, while a chorus of 1,000 serenaded with funeral songs. Hours went by and the crowds didn't diminish. Since many newspapers published the itinerary of Abraham Lincoln's funeral train, Americans knew when it was going to be passing through their area. Even if they weren't in one of the major cities where it stopped, many thousands of people still turned out to pay their respects. The train averaged only about 20 miles per hour as it passed through cities, towns, and the countryside. Since stops in cities coincided with daytime viewing hours, much of the travel was done throughout the night. Torches, lanterns, and bonfires were lit along the tracks as if guiding the train along. The train did stop in cities, towns, and stations where there wasn't a public viewing organized, and even then, grieving people turned out en masse. Many stops had small groups that were organized and allowed onto the train, leaving flowers and tokens on the president's casket. When Lincoln's funeral train finally reached Springfield, his casket was put on display at the State House, and after 24 hours, there was the final procession to Oak Ridge Cemetery. By the time Lincoln's casket got there, his son's was waiting for him. The day was almost unbearably warm, and one of the things that stood out to onlookers and eyewitnesses was the smell of lilacs. Bushes were in full bloom across the city, but lilacs were in use for another reason. Even as newspapers began to report on the decidedly sunken and shallow look of the president's body, his embalmer, Charles Brown, struggled to hide the inevitable decay beneath more makeup and perfume made from lilacs, strong-scented flowers chosen to help cover the smell. As Lincoln's body was escorted to Oak Ridge, his beloved horse, Old Bob, followed directly behind the casket. After the service, the gates were locked on the temporary vault, and Lincoln was alone with his son. President Lincoln's body was interred on May 4, 1865, but that actually wasn't the end of things. Lincoln's body has actually been moved a whopping 17 times over fears he was going to be a target for grave robbers and body snatchers. Was he? Yes. In the latter half of the 19th century, the grave robbing trade was alive and well in America. It was driven in large part by the medical industry for a number of reasons, but Lincoln's tomb was a unique case. There was at least one full-fledged plot to steal Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom, and it was the brainchild of a gang of Chicago counterfeiters. The Secret Service put an end to their scheme, but it became pretty clear that a permanent solution needed to be found. For starters, this included a group of civilians organized specifically to guard the beloved president's body. Over the course of almost 2 decades, Lincoln's remains were repeatedly moved to secret locations and carefully guarded, until the late president's eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, insisted that a final memorial and monument be constructed. Upon its completion in 1901, there were questions about whether or not the president's remains were still in the casket, so they decided to open it. He was. A group of witnesses confirmed that yes, Lincoln was actually in the casket, which was then entombed beneath 2 tons of concrete. Abraham Lincoln continued to shape the country even in death, starting with the fact that his funeral services actually helped popularize the kind of funerals many Americans have today. Before Lincoln's death, embalming was a procedure reserved for soldiers so they could be transported home from the battlefield for burial. Once Lincoln was embalmed, the procedure became more mainstream. Ripples were also felt in 1963 with the assassination of another president. After John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy instructed that the funeral follow the same plan as Lincoln's.
There's only one word to describe the picture here, and that's grief.
The two presidents even laid in state on the exact same catafalque in the exact same room in the White House. And when it came time to move JFK to the cemetery, the same horse-drawn wagon was used. Also present, the riderless horse. The role played by Lincoln's beloved Old Bob was filled by a horse called Black Jack in JFK's funeral. Abraham Lincoln's funeral was designed to help an already ailing nation grieve together in a very public and meaningful way. His death, and in fact his life, was perhaps best summed up by Charles B. Sedgwick, who gave a public eulogy in Syracuse, New York, saying, "He went at the call of duty to the post of danger, and although wrecked, his life is by no means lost."